for young people were murdered in their sleep. The man who did it stood in court, said nothing, and walked away with his life. But what he walked in may be far worse than death. Stay with me until the end, because what is happening to Brian Kohberger inside that prison is something the headlines never told you. If this case is already pulling you in, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like. Leave a comment telling me what you think about the sentence Brian Kohberger received. I read every single one of them. On July 23, 2025, inside a Boise, Idaho courtroom, Brian Kohberger sat perfectly still while the people he had destroyed spoke directly into his face. He did not flinch. He did not react. He simply sat there, expressionless, as one by one the survivors and the grieving walked to that podium and told him exactly what he had taken from them. Dylan Mortensen, a surviving roommate who was only 19 years old when Kohberger invaded the home on King Road, stood before the court and described what life has looked like since that night in November 2022. She described losing the ability to trust the world around her. She described the shattering of something deep inside herself, something she had not even known could break. She described having to sleep in her mother's bed because closing her eyes in the dark had become unbearable. Kaylee Goncalves' father, Steve, turned the podium so that it faced Kohberger directly, looked the man in the eye, and called him a complete joke. Kaylee's sister, Olivia, locked eyes with the man who murdered her little sister and called him exactly what forensic psychologists had long suspected he was: a sociopath. The courtroom erupted in applause when she finished speaking. And through every single word, through every tear and every accusation and every plea, Brian Kohberger said absolutely nothing. He had been given the opportunity to speak. He declined. Judge Stephen Hippler did not hold back. He called Kohberger a faceless coward who slithered into a home and senselessly slaughtered 4 innocent people. Then he sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary and $270,000 in fines. But here is what most people watching from home did not fully understand that day. The sentence Brian Kohberger received may be far more brutal than the death penalty he spent 2.5 years desperately trying to avoid. And the reason has everything to do with what happens inside the walls of the place where he will spend every remaining day of his life. To understand what Brian Kohberger's existence looks like now, you need to understand where Idaho sends the people it never intends to release. The Idaho Maximum Security Institution sits on a flat stretch of desert outside of Kuna, approximately 20 miles south of Boise. It opened in 1989 and was built to hold 535 of the state's most violent and dangerous male offenders. A double perimeter fence reinforced with razor wire encircles the entire compound. An electronic detection system monitors every inch of it at all times. In 2024, Security Journal America has named it one of the 15 worst prisons in the United States, placing it alongside Attica in New York, San Quentin in California, and ADX Florence in Colorado, the facility the world knows as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The conditions inside have drawn national scrutiny for years. Inmates have reported being confined alone for 23 hours a day with almost no human contact. Showers are limited to 3 times per week. Meals are eaten alone inside the cell. Recreation areas, described by prisoners as large chain-link metal cages, sit on concrete floors that inmates claim are soaked with human waste. In 2024, roughly 90 inmates organized a 6-day hunger strike in protest. They cited delays in medical care, extreme isolation, an HVAC system clogged with garbage and bodily fluids, and maintenance conditions they claimed had gone unaddressed for decades. This is where Brian Kohberger now lives. This is where he will die. After his sentencing, Kohberger was transferred from Ada County Jail to the Maximum Security Institution and placed in J Block, a restricted housing unit that holds around 30 inmates. Those who have been inside describe it as a prison within a prison. Kohberger is confined to a single-person cell. He is moved only in restraints. He receives a shower every other day. He is allowed 1 hour of outdoor recreation per day inside a concrete courtyard surrounded by walls. Some inmates are placed inside individual metal cages during that hour because they are considered too dangerous to be in an open space without a barrier. His meals are passed through a slot in the door. His neighbors on J Block include Chad Daybell, sentenced to death for the murder of his first wife and two of his second wife's children. Thomas Creech, a serial killer who has been incarcerated for more than half a century. And Gerald Pizzuto, who is awaiting execution for multiple murders across 2 states. These are the men Brian Kohberger will spend the rest of his life beside. But the physical conditions of that facility are not what appears to be breaking him. It is the psychological warfare. Within 1 day of arriving at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, Brian Kohberger filed his first request to be moved. According to retired homicide detective Chris McDaniel, who has maintained contact with sources inside the facility, the other inmates on J Block were expecting Kohberger. They knew he was coming, and they had a plan. The air vents connecting the cells on J Block became a weapon. Inmates began taking turns shouting through those vents into Kohberger's cell around the clock. Day and night, they kicked their doors. They used the vent system to deliver a constant, relentless stream of psychological abuse that Kohberger could not escape, could not silence, and could not sleep through. McDaniel described it directly. The inmates literally climb up into the grate and yell at him. They take turns. It is relentless. And by all accounts, it is driving him to the edge. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Kohberger's response to all of it revealed something forensic psychologists have been watching closely. He complained to the guards. In prison culture, complaining about another inmate is considered ratting. Former prison pastor Keith Raharja explained what that means for someone in Kohberger's position. Complaining about other inmates, he said, is never the right move. You shut your mouth and you do your time. But Kohberger did not shut his mouth. He filed written complaints. He alleged that inmates were threatening him and sexually harassing him. And with each complaint, the taunting escalated. Dr. Gary Brucato, a clinical and forensic psychologist, offered a framework for understanding what is happening to Kohberger's mind behind those walls. Offenders like Kohberger, he explained, typically seek social acceptance and control of their surroundings. When Kohberger accepted his plea deal, he likely believed he had reclaimed some measure of command over his situation. He had avoided the death penalty. He had refused to explain his crimes. He held the one thing the families and the public desperately wanted, the answer to why. That gave him power, or so he believed. But prison stripped all of that away the moment he walked through the door. Instead of the control he craved, he found himself being ridiculed and mocked, robbed of the infamy, the attention, and the dominance he had constructed inside his own mind. And the deterioration has been visible. By December 2025, 5 months into his sentence, Kohberger escalated to a new tactic. He began threatening to harm himself if authorities did not move him out of J Block. McDaniel noted the careful phrasing. Kohberger was not saying he would kill himself. He was saying he would harm himself. The question, according to McDaniel, is whether Kohberger is genuinely unraveling or strategically leveraging the threat as a tool to force the prison's hand. Officials responded by increasing cell checks. They kept him further isolated, but they did not move him. His complaints extended even further. He reportedly took issue with the bananas being served to him. Not the right kind, apparently. Whether that meant they were bruised or simply not to his liking was never made clear. But it became another written complaint filed to guards already working 12-hour shifts at a chronically understaffed facility. McDaniel put it plainly, it is about power and control. He was a nobody until he murdered 4 people. He was irrelevant to the world. And now he is Brian Kohberger, the man who holds the one thing everyone wants, the answer, and he is trying to use it. He is trying to leverage the only card he has left. Meanwhile, the people Kohberger destroyed continue to carry the weight of what he did on a night in November 2022 that changed everything and took everything. Now I need to go back to that night, because to truly understand the weight of what was lost, you need to understand who these 4 people were, what that house on King Road looked like on the inside, and exactly what unfolded in those early morning hours when the world was asleep and no one knew yet that everything had changed. The house at 913 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, was a typical off-campus rental. A two-story structure with a sliding glass door on the back, a quiet street, a neighborhood full of college students living the ordinary rhythms of university life. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan were best friends who had grown up in the same orbit and ended up at the University of Idaho together. They were the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences, who showed up in each other's photos in every memory, who talked about the future with the easy confidence of young women who had no reason yet to believe it could be taken from them. Kaylee was from Rathdrum, Idaho. She was 21 years old, athletic and driven, with a personality that filled every room she walked into. She had plans after graduation. She had a life mapped out. Madison Mogan was from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. She was also 21, warm and loyal, the kind of person her friends described as someone who made everyone around her feel like they mattered. The two of them had been inseparable for years. Xana Kernadle was 20 years old and from Post Falls, Idaho. She was studying marketing and had a steady relationship with Ethan Chapin, who lived in a different dormitory across campus. Ethan Chapin was also 20 years old, from Conway, Washington, a triplet, the kind of young man his family described as someone with an easy laugh and a genuine kindness that was impossible to fake. He was not supposed to be at the house on King Road that night. He was there because Xana was there. That detail, that simple fact of love and proximity, has haunted the people who knew him ever since. On the night of November 12th into the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, the four of them had been out. Kaylee and Madison had gone to a bar called the Corner Club and then to a food truck called Grub Truck before returning to the house in the early morning hours. Xana and Ethan had been at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house. The two surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, had also been out that night and returned to the house separately. By around 1:45 in the morning, everyone was home. The lights eventually went out. The house went quiet. What investigators would later piece together from phone records, security footage, and physical evidence was a timeline that unfolded in the darkness between approximately 3 and 4 in the morning. Brian Kohberger, then a 28-year-old criminology PhD student at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, had driven approximately 10 miles from his apartment to the house on King Road. He parked nearby. He approached the house on foot. He entered through the sliding glass door on the back of the structure. He was carrying a fixed-blade knife later identified as a K-bar-style tactical knife. He moved through the house in the dark. He knew the layout, or he learned it quickly. He went upstairs. The medical examiner's findings were devastating in their detail. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan were found together in the same room. Xana Kernadle was found in her own room. Ethan Chapin was found with Xana. All four had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds on Xana Kernadle's body told a particular story. More than 50 stab wounds, many of them defensive. She had been awake. She had fought back in the dark against a man with a knife inside her own bedroom, in a house where she was supposed to be safe. That image of a 20-year-old woman fighting for her life in the place where she slept is one that investigators, prosecutors, and the families of the victims have never been able to set aside. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk were asleep in their rooms on the main floor. They survived. In the days and weeks that followed, they would piece together fragments of that night that they had not understood at the time. Sounds they had heard, moments they had dismissed, a door they had or had not checked. Mortensen later testified that she had heard crying that night, sound she had not been able to explain, sound she would spend years trying to make sense of. Funk described opening her door at some point during the night and seeing a figure in the hallway. She had assumed it was a housemate. She had gone back to sleep. Neither of them knew until the following afternoon, when a concerned friend came to the house and found what was inside, that anything had happened at all. The discovery of the four bodies on the afternoon of November 13th sent a shock through Moscow, Idaho, and through the University of Idaho campus that has never fully subsided. Moscow is a small city of roughly 25,000 people. The university anchors it. Crime of this nature was not something the community had any framework for absorbing. Students were terrified. Parents were driving to campus to collect their children. Rumors spread faster than facts. For weeks, investigators said little publicly while working to identify a suspect. For 6 weeks, the community lived in a state of fear that is difficult to describe to anyone who was not inside it. Brian Kohberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022, at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where he had traveled for the holidays. DNA recovered from a knife sheath left at the crime scene connected him to the murders. He was a PhD student studying the psychology of criminal behavior. He had access to academic research on how killers operate, how investigators think, and how evidence is collected. He had chosen to study the very thing he was in the process of becoming. That detail alone stopped people cold when it emerged. He was extradited to Idaho and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The case took 2.5 years to reach resolution. Kohberger's legal team fought aggressively, challenging the DNA evidence, raising questions about the investigation, and at one point pursuing an alibi defense based on his claim that he had been driving alone late at night. In June 2025, just weeks before his trial was scheduled to begin, Kohberger entered an Alford plea, a legal maneuver that allowed him to accept the consequences of a guilty verdict while still not admitting guilt. It was a calculated move. It meant he would never have to stand in open court and describe what he did. It meant the families would never hear from his own mouth the words they had waited 2.5 years to hear. And it meant he avoided the death penalty. Prosecutors and police have confirmed that no motive has ever been established. No link between Kohberger and his victims was ever found. Moscow police stated publicly that there was a reason this particular house was chosen, but what that reason is, no one knows. Bill Thompson, the lead prosecutor on the case, said he does not believe a motive will ever be known. FBI profilers who worked the case from the beginning shared that same assessment. And so Brian Kohberger, the man who holds the only answer, has chosen to take it with him into that cell on J Block, where it will sit beside him for the next 40, 50, perhaps 60 years. He avoided the death penalty. In Idaho, that would have meant years, possibly decades, of appeals inside a system that has struggled to carry out executions at all. Thomas Creech, one of Kohberger's own neighbors on J Block, survived a botched lethal injection attempt in 2024. Idaho has since made the firing squad its primary method of execution, but renovations to the execution chamber have not been completed. Death row inmates in Idaho occupy the same facility as Kohberger. Some of them have been there for decades. And in a grim and almost unbearable irony, they may have something Brian Kohberger will never have. An end date, even if it is uncertain, even if it is endlessly delayed. There is at least a theoretical possibility that their sentence has a conclusion. For Brian Kohberger, there is no conclusion. There is no appeal. There is no parole hearing. There is no transfer request that will ever be granted. There is only J Block, only the vents, only the 23 hours inside a cell, only the 1 hour in a concrete yard surrounded by caged men, only the restraints every time he moves, only the slot in the door where his meals appear, only the voices of men who despise him, echoing through the walls day and night without end. Christy Goncalves, Kaylee's mother, stared directly at Kohberger during sentencing and said exactly what his future holds. May you continue to live your life in misery. You are officially the property of the state of Idaho. 5 months in, and by all accounts, that misery has already begun. The families will never get the answer to why. Kohberger may never speak again about what he did. And for the next 4, 5, perhaps 6 decades, he will sit inside that cell while the vents carry the voices of men who will never let him forget it. Kaylee Goncalves had plans after graduation. Madison Mogan had a best friend she would never grow old beside. Xana Kernodle fought back in the dark and deserved so much more than the hand she was dealt. Ethan Chapin was there because he loved someone, and that love cost him everything. They deserved decades. They deserved ordinary Tuesdays and late nights, and the slow, quiet accumulation of a life fully lived. Instead, they got a sliding glass door opening in the dark and a man who has never once explained why. Whether 4 consecutive life sentences is justice, or whether justice was even possible in a case like this, is a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. What do you think? Were 4 life sentences the right call? Or should Brian Kohberger have faced the death penalty? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if this story held your attention from that very first line all the way to this moment, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Story Soft the Missing J. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who follows true crime. Turn on your notifications, because more investigations like this one are coming, and you do not want to be the last to know.